podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy and I am assistant editor of the journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. In 2016, the FHQ will continue publishing a series of 6 special issues in recognition of the Quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513. Next year's special issues are dedicated to Florida history during the 19th century. The first, covering the years 1800 to 1870, will be guest edited by James Cusick, curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History at the University of Florida. The second, covering the years 1870 to 1920, will be guest edited by John David Smith, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Please look forward to publication of these issues in 2016. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Sherry Johnson, professor of history at Florida International University. She is the author of several works on Florida and Latin American history, including Climate and Catastrophe in Cuba and the Atlantic World in the Age of Revolution. In today's interview, Dr. Johnson and I discuss the content of the special issue on the 18th century, a collection of original essays she recruited and guest edited that was recently published as the Winter 2015 issue of the FHQ.
Please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about your academic background.
Thank you. My name is Sherry Johnson. I am a professor of history at Florida International University. I'm a Florida girl through and through. I grew up in South Florida, attended school up north, but as soon as possible, I came back to Florida to attend the university. I went to Broward Community College, back when it was a community college, back in the day. And then I went on to the University of Florida, where I did all of my degrees, and I was lucky to be able to study under and work with some of the most important scholars in Florida and Latin American history. I worked for Sam Proctor in his office in the museum. I was editorial assistant on the Florida Historical Quarterly. I also worked with Michael Gannon. I worked with Eugene Lyon. In fact, the first time I ever went to Cuba, I went with Eugene Lyon and John Hann. In the museum, I got to work with the leading lights in historical archaeology, such as Kathleen Deegan and Jerry Milanich and Bill Keegan, and even when William Maples had his lab across the hall from Sam Proctor's office, we got to learn about his forensic anthropology. And then when I decided to do my PhD in Latin American history, I was again fortunate that University of Florida had one of the top programs in Latin American history. So my immediate mentor was Myrtle McLeod. I also worked with David Bushnell, with Neil McCauley, with Lyle McAllister, with people in the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and some of the great historians of colonial U.S., especially Derritt and Anita Ruttman and Eldon Turner. So my academic pedigree, if you will, is Florida through and through, and I'm proud of it.
That is great. I mean, so many people you've worked with. That's just, it's fascinating, and I'd love to talk about all that. But I do want to focus on the special issue because that's it's coming out as we speak, and I know we're very excited about it at the Quarterly. But can you just tell me a little bit about what your vision was for this special issue on 18th century Florida?
Yes, my vision is reflective of the problems of the 18th century. The 18th century is a challenge, not only because the 18th century is broken up into Spanish sovereignty, British sovereignty, then back to Spanish sovereignty. After 250 years, Spain had to give up Florida, and then it got it back again. But it's not just sort of the obvious, the change from one regime to the other, but the whole world is changing around the lived lives of the 18th century. The Enlightenment is happening, the change in commercial activity, but it's also a change in mindset of the people. And contemporaries who lived this experience in the 18th century knew about it, but historians seem to be slow to pick this up. And on one hand, we tend to compartmentalize. In other words, we make the sharp break from the Spanish to the British and then back to the Spanish sovereignty. But we have to understand that the people who lived these experiences didn't actually do it that way, which is where the major conceptualization of my issue comes in, and that's the concept of the Atlantic world. These linkages between and among people and societies and economic systems don't go away. And so, first and foremost, the idea that I wanted to bring into this special issue was that the Atlantic world is a fundamental part of 18th century Florida. There's a caveat in there, and it's about how Atlantic world history is done. Atlantic world history doesn't mean that every place is eligible just because they happen to be bathed by the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. There has to be some kind of linkage between what's happening in a particular place, such as St. Augustine or East Florida or even West Florida, and outside societies. And so when I asked the contributors if they would be interested in having their articles be considered for the special issue, they had to show a connection between what's happening in the region under study and also what's happening based upon things from the outside. And I think all of our contributors do that. Every single one of the articles that you will read makes that connection either to Florida conceptually as a process, but also Florida set within the regional and international historiography in their articles. The second concept I wanted to continue is the issue of archaeology and historical archaeology. And I was very fortunate that one of our articles does deal with the historical archaeology in a hands-on basis, the article by Chuck Mead investigating the two shipwrecks. I think this is important for a multiplicity of reasons. Historical archaeology and history go hand in hand. I don't think one can be done without the other, and I think we're learning this more and more. The linkages between them are natural. And secondly, with the Florida Historical Society's initiative on incorporating and creating a new institute, the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute, I think we'll see more and more of these linkages be produced in the quarterly, and also the scholarship opening up to these possibilities. So those are my two visions.
I think that's amazing perspectives to take with this issue, and couldn't agree more with everything you said. And you mentioned a little bit about the contributors and their focus. Can you talk a little bit more about what each contributor was kind of, how they were looking at the topic and what they were specifically focusing on?
Yes, I'll be glad to. Thank you. We have 5 contributors in addition to my historiographical article. They are Chuck Mead from St. Augustine Lighthouse, Susan Schwartz at Florida International University, Roger Smith, who's also at the St. Augustine Lighthouse, James G. Cusick, who is the section head of the P.K. Young Library of History, and Diane Boucher, who is currently at Fitchburg State in Massachusetts. Chuck Mead did his undergraduate degrees at Florida State, and he's currently working at College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. Susan Schwartz is ABD at Florida International University in the PhD program in Atlantic Civ. Roger Smith completed his PhD at the University of Florida in 2013. Jim Cusick completed his PhD also at the University of Florida in 1993 in anthropology, specifically historical archaeology. And Diane Boucher just completed her PhD in 2014 at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. My goal was to bring in a combination of senior scholars and junior scholars who not only bring the years of expertise like Jim Cusick brings in, but also scholars who are on the cutting edge of the new trends in Atlantic world history. Each of these contributors makes a contribution. For Chuck Mead's article, he takes two shipwrecks that bracket the British period and looks at the difference in the wrecks, not only in the articles that are recovered, the artifacts that are recovered from these British shipwrecks, but also extrapolates the experiences of the passengers on the different shipwrecks. Susan Schwartz's article on the James Grant administration utilizes the collections in the Kislak Foundation in Miami Lakes. It's a revisionist look at James Grant's administration. The historiography is pervasive in thinking that all of these colonies, whether Spanish or British, were unsuccessful. Schwartz argues that quite to the contrary, James Grant was an extremely successful British governor, and he accomplished quite a bit of what he intended to do, albeit it was slow going, but at the end of his regime, he had accomplished much in the line of economic reforms, what he intended and the mandate that he had been given by the court in England. Roger Smith's is perhaps the most provocative. He looks at the conduct of the campaigns in the Revolutionary War, and what he argues in his article is that instead of the South being insignificant within the grander scheme of Revolutionary War efforts, there was a concerted effort to implement a Southern strategy even before the Revolution began. The important part of his article is not only does it fly in the face of current Southern historiography that says the campaigns began in 1780, but he shows that both on the part of the British and the part of the Americans, specifically George Washington, they had intended or hoped to make attempts in the South much earlier than 1780. These attempts were unsuccessful, and they have been erased from our historical memory, but they nonetheless existed, and they cost resources and time for both sides in the conflict. Beginning with Jim Cusick's article, we move into the Second Spanish period. Jim looks at the issue of cases of deviance in sexual conduct in St. Augustine, and he examines a series of cases involving very young boys and issues of sodomy between them and older men. Jim's article, which is meticulously researched and meticulously written, fits into two cutting-edge issues in the historiography. First of all, in Latin America, there is a trend that's on the forefront. It's up and coming within Latin American historiography, and that's the question of legal history. Jim shows convincingly that the processes and procedures that were used throughout Spanish America were in place in St. Augustine as these cases were carried through the courts, and he has detailed how the legal advisors both to the Spanish crown, which was the prosecution in this case, and to the defendants, which were the children and their guardians, are followed to the letter. But even more importantly, Jim makes an argument that I think is also key, and that's that in the fact that these processes were carried out to the letter as if they were conducted in Mexico City or in Lima, shows that St. Augustine, instead of being this remote frontier, was really a fundamental part of the Spanish Empire as a whole. And I think this is another key issue that we have to consider in looking at the 18th century, is the degree to which Florida was part and parcel of its respective imperial grand design, if you will. Finally, Diane Boucher's article on the people on the border which have been turned banditti. Diane looks at the conflicts among the leftover settlers and the cusp of the British period into the Second Spanish period. She looks at this within, again, new conceptual historiographical trends that violence can be part of life, depending upon the degree of control that the metropolitan government has over its inhabitants. It's hard to believe that the last time the banditti have been examined was in 1939, when Joseph Locke introduced this in his collection of documents, East Florida. And Diane takes this concept and looks at the people who are crossing back and forth across the border, affecting both societies, affecting societies in Georgia, affecting societies in Florida, and affecting the people themselves. And she does this by focusing on a particular murder case of a very interesting patriarch of a family called O'Neill. O'Neill had been settlers. They were planters in Virginia. They were British loyalists, and as part of the loyalist evacuation, they moved south, and Henry O'Neill, who was a Catholic, found a home within the administration, the returned administration in Spanish Florida. Because he found a home within the Spanish administration, he was the target of the border violence, and I don't want to give it away, but not very nice things happened to Henry O'Neill as a consequence of his identifying, he as a Catholic and a Virginian, identifying with the Spanish governor and with the Spanish governor's representative on the frontier, whose name was Carlos Howard, also an Irishman, and also very much part of these border conflicts. So these are the contributions of the scholars who have given their time and their scholarly efforts, and I hope that our readers will not only read their articles but also look up their other academic production, look up their articles, look up their recently defended or soon-to-be defended dissertations, and get to know these people who truly represent the up-and-coming edge of Florida history.
It's a fascinating array of people and topics you've were able to get to work on this issue, and you're right. I don't want to give it away, but I learned a great deal from reading it already. In addition, or maybe kind of elaborating on that, through their research and just the research of others on 18th century Florida, I guess, are there any specific events, movements, or peoples in 18th century Florida that stand out for their regional or even wider impact?
Bringing Florida back into its context within the 18th century, Florida changed greatly because the world changed greatly. And, for example, the change in imperial sovereignties, not just in Florida, but, for example, within the Spanish monarchies. Spain went through 5 different monarchs over the period of time, and the change in those policies reflected in Florida. For instance, is the conduct of the wars in the 1730s, which I'm currently working on as a new project. With every change in Spanish policy, the change in monarch from Ferdinand VI to Charles III in 1758, the conduct of the war that had been going on, which is known as the 7 Years' War in the Caribbean, versus the French and Indian War in the United States. The way that Spain approached that war was radically different. Ferdinand VI was an Anglophile. He chose to remain neutral and stay out of the 7 Years' War. Charles III despised the British, with good reason, based upon previous experiences in Europe. And so the changing approach to this worldwide conflict is important to understand what happened in Spanish Florida and subsequently in British Florida. Spain's ill-timed entry into the 7 Years' War led to the loss of Havana, and then subsequently, to get Havana back, Florida was ceded to Great Britain. But this just didn't happen as an isolate. This happened as a consequence of processes that are going on. I think that, i.e. the loss of Florida in 1763, to the British became one of the fundamental questions that must be dealt with in more than just a localized basis. Many people have attempted to do this. We deal with this in the special issue, but I think the consequences for everybody concerned can be examined in greater detail. In addition, the change in worldwide economic policy, moving out of an economic system that is restricted, especially in the case of the Spaniards, who clung to a mercantilistic policy up until 1763 and beyond, in the face of a rapidly expanding capitalist economic perception on the part of the Brits, on the part of the Dutch, for example. This has enormous consequences that are only beginning to be understood. One of the important books that I think everybody should read, it's quite a small book, but it sets the stage, is Joyce Harmon's Trade and Privateering in Spanish Florida. Framed within the concept of privateering is an important underlying message. Spanish Florida could not provision itself, and in the face of starvation, people turned to alternate sources. In Spanish Florida, in the 1730s and 1740s, the people who were bringing in the provisions are merchants from New York. This is a topic that begs for an in-depth study. And these are just some of the things that are notable in Florida in the 18th century, not only from an international perspective in terms of international warfare, international commerce, international social movements. One of the things that we have not discussed, and that's the question of West Florida. West Florida plays an important part with its interface with the French Empire up until 1763. But a secondary question is the question of the indigenous people. The indigenous people play an enormous part in West Florida, of course, but also in East Florida. And we are getting more and more studies who show that the border that existed between and among these colonial powers was non-existent. Unfortunately, time constraints in my issue don't allow me to go into that, but people will be happy to hear that a good amount of this literature will be picked up in the subsequent issue that Jim Cusick will be editing for our next special issue. So those are just the conceptual parameters that I think could be revisited, that are important milestone historiographical points for the entire 18th century.
Kind of taking a different approach, I guess, or different angle. I know you probably get these questions a lot. I get them a lot. People that aren't familiar with Florida history, they're always asking, well, what happened 300 years ago mean to us today, or 200 years ago? So I'll pose the question to you. What are the enduring legacies of 18th century Florida, and how should we regard the region and period today?
Well, I think the enduring legacies, first and foremost, I think, is multiculturalism. And whereas the 18th century has been termed the century of warfare, the legacy of Florida is that people had to find ways to survive, had to find ways to adapt to the conditions that faced them. People did just that. The second legacy of Florida is its geography. We cannot change what Florida is. Florida is a southern and a semi-tropical state, and we cannot change the water or the maritime legacy that states do not have. We have 1,000 miles of coastline. Therefore, the things that existed in the 18th and the 17th and the 16th century still exist in Florida today. Not just the question of illicit activity and linkages outside and with others from outside the state, but also the reliance upon maritime industries. In addition, Florida has a legacy as a rural state, and so Florida relied up until recently upon an agricultural industry that it still relies upon to this day. So the things that made Florida an important contributor, things that we don't recognize, are legacies of the past. An example is the cattle and the citrus industries, still backbones of Florida's economy that were initiated in the very earliest years of colonization.
That's a great answer. I'm going to use that from now on when people ask me those questions.
Sorry, I didn't think of this as legacies. I thought of a different legacy question, but go ahead. That was off the top of my head.
I thought it was great. Do you want to add? You can answer it any way you want to.
I'm thinking of answering when we did the Ponce de Leon book, and besides the obvious cultural and the Hispanic heritage and the multicultural heritage, I mean the indigenous heritage, the African American heritage, all those multicultural groups make up what we are today. You know, all of these things come together into a Florida that has never been quite like any other state. So, anyway, sorry.
Well, no, that's good. Well, and let me ask you this last question, and you know, obviously throw anything out there you want to throw out there. Is there anything else you would like our audience to know about this issue, your specific article, or your research in general?
Yes. I think, as has become obvious, if we want to move Florida history forward, Florida history must reflect trends in the wider historiographical traditions worldwide, not just U.S. history or not just Latin American history. And if we buy into this Atlantic world concept, we can't do this by half measures. We can't take parts of it and say, oh, this works for one person, but it doesn't work for this. And so I'd like to give a couple examples where Florida history has been on the cutting edge. One of those is revisiting the British period. We have known for years, as early as Mark Boyd's and Jose Navarro's articles in the 1950s, that there were not hard and fast borders between British Florida and, for example, the exiles in Cuba. John Worth introduced this in his masterful work on the indigenous people. John Hann introduced this again on his work on the indigenous people. James Covington continued this legacy on the fishing ranchos on the west coast of Florida. But it's only in the past year that an article has been published by one of Dan Schaefer's students on this topic, specifically about the indigenous connections with the exiles in Cuba. That is a very fruitful area that I think should be pursued. In addition, we need to rethink virtually everything about the periods. Another example, the Second Spanish period. We forget that the guys who came back were the victors. They were on the winning side in the American Revolution. And people like Vicente de Céspedes and Juan Manuel de Quesada, even Enrique White, had been part and parcel of the greatest victory for Spain in a very long time. They were part of Galvez's clan, and Galvez's clan was predominant in Spanish politics for 20 years or more. And so when they came back, they brought those conceptual ideas with them. They were returning victors, if you will. And this tends to be able to think in these terms mean we have to underinflate from the hyperinflation the status of the people who were in Spanish Florida. Most of the people who had to come in contact with these returning Spanish officials were not residents. They did not have the concept of vecino or citizen, if you will, in Spanish terms. And so, except for their economic influence, they didn't have any influence on policy. Secondly, and this is a very important point that's not brought up, is that under the Spanish system, they didn't have a guarantee to land ownership. The land ownership in the Spanish Caribbean was not settled until 1815. And under the terms of Spanish law, which again we're learning, their property could be seized and was seized for any infraction against Spanish law. So that's another concept that we should probably think of in future work. Finally, and I think, in my opinion, the single most important factor in subsequent events in Second Spanish period is the sudden death of Charles III in 1788. This, to my knowledge, with the exception of my first book, nobody has, and I didn't do a very extensive job, nobody has ever integrated Spanish court politics into what happens in Florida, ever. And so with the death of Charles III, an entirely new regime came to power, his son Charles IV. The people who surrounded Charles IV were bitter enemies of the Galvez clan. And these rivalries went back to the 1760s, but they came to the forefront in 1788 and especially in 1792 when the last of the old Charles III's advisors were purged out. These advisors came to prominence in important administrative positions in the Caribbean, and subsequently that affected how things occurred in Second Spanish period Florida. For example, the intrigues of Citizen Genet, I believe, were directly attributable to his knowledge of the change in regime in Spain, and ditto the Patriot War in 1795. The people who instigated the Patriot War absolutely knew the problems that the governor Quesada and the interim governor Morales were encountering from the Captain General in Florida. Again, by opening up the Atlantic world perspective and bringing these things in, I think we lead ourselves open to fresh interpretations. Those are just examples from the Second Spanish period. They can be extrapolated to the British period. They most certainly can be extrapolated to the international conflicts from the War of Spanish Succession and definitely into the wars, for example, wars of Jenkins' Ear in 39 to 41 and onward. And so these are things that I think scholars need to be investigating. My personal approach, of course, is from an environmental and a disaster perspective, and except for 2 articles that I did and a few little popular things, virtually nothing has been done on the impact of extreme weather events. And so those are things I hope that scholars will be looking for in the future.
Well, Professor Johnson, I think this issue is going to answer a lot of questions for a lot of people. I think more questions might be developed as a result of the articles, but that's a good thing. That shows how healthy Florida history is. Thank you very much for both your efforts with the issue, and thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Dan. I want to thank everybody who's made this possible. I want to thank Connie Lester. I want to thank you, Dan Murphy. I want to thank the Florida Historical Society staff and the student assistants, the University of Central Florida for hosting the Florida Historical Quarterly. Especially, I want to thank Dean Jose Fernandez of UCF College of Arts and Humanities and the J.I. Kislak Foundation of Miami Lakes for their generous support. I do want to thank you, Dan Murphy, and Jim Cusick for reading my article. But most importantly, I want to thank the contributors for their cooperation and their scholarship and their help in putting this edition together. It's really important that without them, there would not be an issue.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the Quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ is publishing a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future volumes as well. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.